I know that this is going to be a first-rate webinar. Why? We have two excellent speakers, Philip Lymbery, Global CEO of Compassion in World Farming, and Tim Lang, Professor at City University, London. The bios are in the chat function, so you can find them there. I will briefly pull out the highlights. Philip is president of the Eurogroup for Animals. He's also been appointed champion for the UN Food Systems Summit. So that's two enormous feathers in his already prodigious cap. And I'd also like to share with you the fact that while preparing for this webinar, he was also writing the concluding words of the third volume of the Farmageddon trilogy, which is entitled 60 Harvests Left. Tim adds a lot of EU expertise, which is very appropriate for a UPEP meeting. He was in the 1980s, he was food policy advisor to the Commissioner for the Environment. He's been active in European Parliament and EU decisions and decision-making and debates about food, health, and the environment at the EU and also at member state levels for the last 3 decades, and also has been an advisor to ECOSOC. And all this in the end will have led to the farm to fork strategy. Second reason for excellence is you, the audience. We've got a lot of people out there, and we expect some really good questions from you, and therefore a good Q&A section. Julie is behind the scenes to run everything and make sure that it and we are on the road. For the Q&A, please type in your question in the Q&A function on your screen, not in chat, because that's exclusively for the bios. When we get to the Q&A session, I shall ask you to ask your questions individually, and Julie will unmute you so that you can do this. And that way we'll achieve full participation by everyone in this webinar. The presentations, the two presentations, are being recorded. The Q&A session is not recorded. So enough from me and enough on the background. Philip, start us off.
So David, thank you so much for your very kind introduction and for having me here, indeed, to EU PEP for having me back. Real pleasure to be here tonight with you, Sir David, and with Professor Tim Lang. A real privilege to be sharing the stage. And what I want to talk about this evening is something as small and insignificant as saving the planet. And I do have some slides that I would like to share with you, if I may. So let me pull those up. And tell me if you can see the puffin.
I can see a puffin.
Wonderful. So saving the planet, essentially with nature-friendly, animal welfare-friendly farming and less meat and dairy and ending factory farming. That's the thesis tonight. And it's 5 years, of course, almost to the day when the Brexit vote happened. And in that disunity, what we've seen in the ensuing 5 years is that disunity is given way to a new wave of coming together, a feeling that we are all in this together. The pandemic, that shared adversity, has helped to galvanize that feeling, along with a growing realization that we are under a siege of our own making, with the growing climate and nature emergencies that are coming to the fore. All of this gives us a shared feeling that, in my view, protecting people means protecting the environment and animals too. So how did we get here, and why do we need regenerative farming? Well, the first thing is to take us back 10,000 years ago, when we as a species, Homo sapiens, we took a decision that we were going to dispense with being hunter-gatherers and essentially move from a nomadic lifestyle to be settlers, agricultural settlers. And in that moment, we put our trust and our future in the soil, in the land. And things were harmonious, pretty much, for the best part of 10,000 years. But one single human lifetime ago, that contract that we had with the soil, we started to tear up. We had a change, a sea change in the way that we produce food. Nature-friendly farming became industrial farming, factory farming, and things started to look very different. So where are we today? Well, one of the reasons why we moved into an era of industrial agriculture was the need that is summed up in the phrase feeding the world. So where are we with that? Well, we have a world population of 7.8 billion people. 80 billion animals are now raised and slaughtered every year. 2/3 of them are raised on those factory farms. Animals that are confined indoors or in feedlots and fed grain. Our food, in all of its senses, contributes more than up to 37% of all greenhouse gases, so more than 1/3 of all greenhouse gases. And of that, the livestock sector contributes nearly 15%. And that is more direct emissions. That is more emissions, than all of the direct emissions from the world's planes, trains, and cars put together. Agriculture has become a big deal. It occupies half the world's habitable land. So what happens on that land matters to so much else. 83% of that half of the habitable land surface is dedicated to animal production, meat, dairy, and eggs. And that meat, dairy, and eggs provides us with 37% of protein and 18% of our calories. So that's what we're using most of a big chunk of the planet to produce. In short, we're being shortchanged. And are we feeding the world? Well, we have 820 million people hungry, yet we have a food system that produces enough for up to 7.5 billion people on the planet. One of the big problems is that we waste so much of the food that is produced. The biggest single source of food waste is in feeding human edible grains, cereals, and soya to industrially reared factory farmed animals. Nearly 2/3 of EU cereals are used as animal feed. 40 to 45% of the entire world grain harvest is used to feed industrially reared animals. Globally, factory farming consumes enough crops to feed more than half of humanity today. So we have to ask ourselves, in the last half century, have we been feeding the world or feeding the world's factory farms? Actually, what we're doing is trying to feed ourselves and feeding those factory farms in a way that is stretching planetary boundaries. And this diagram puts it very well, that there are 9 planetary boundaries, some of which we're already going beyond safe limits, including with biodiversity and nitrogen pollution. Remember that nitrogen is a big, industrial agriculture is a big source of nitrogen. And those that are the planetary boundaries that are coming up behind those two are climate change and land system change. So what we're doing to the planet in continuing to expand our activities into existing wild lands. What we've seen in this last half a century or more, this single human lifetime, is that things have been disappearing from the countryside. Hens have been disappearing from bushes and fields and put into cages so small they can't even stretch their wings. Pigs have been disappearing from woodland edges where they would build a nest a metre high to rear their piglets. And instead, mother pigs put in crates so narrow they can't turn around for weeks at a time, made to face the wall. And grazing animals like cattle have been disappearing from our fields to end up in mega dairies and feedlots, in this one being a US feedlot. But it's not just farmed animals that have been disappearing from the countryside. Farmland wildlife, biodiversity has taken a decline as well. Birds like barn owls, used to find them a pair breeding on just about every farm across Britain and much of Europe. Now in Britain, you're lucky if you find a pair breeding 1 in every 75 farms. Once common farmland species like grey partridges, corn buntings, and tree sparrows have declined by more than 90% in the last 40 to 50 years. And it's not just birds, it's also mammals. Hedgehogs in Britain have halved in number since the turn of this century. And you know what? I live on a farm. I live on a farm in West Sussex. I've lived here for nearly 4 years, and I have never seen a hedgehog. That's how impoverished our countryside has become. And the reason for wildlife declines is important to understand. It's the two sides of factory farming. The first side is where the animals are kept that we're familiar with, where it looks like a space-saving idea, but actually isn't, because it needs a second side. By taking animals out of the countryside and putting them into cages and confinement, we have to dedicate vast acreages of relatively scarce arable land elsewhere to grow their feed. And if we put all of the land area being used to grow animal feed, if we put it into one field, all of the land worldwide being used to grow animal feed in one field, it would cover an area the size of the entire European Union and the UK put together. And what happens on that land area is intensive animal production usually comes with intensive crop production, which means that fields get bigger. And as those fields get bigger, the trees, the bushes, and the hedges disappear. And chemicals come in, chemical fertilizers and pesticides, which means that the weeds that produce the seeds and the insects that are needed by the birds, the bats, and the bees, and just about everything else to feed upon, they disappear. Even the worms under the soil and the soil itself starts disappearing, leaving you with the crop. And then we take that crop and we feed it to those factory farmed animals who waste the vast majority of the calories and protein in conversion to meat, milk, and eggs. It's not confined to just the European countryside and the UK countryside. The tentacles of factory farming reach out much wider. Palm products are not only found in processed foods, but they're also used as animal feed, particularly for cattle in the European Union and the UK. And what that is doing is causing the decline of habitats for these critically endangered Sumatran elephants, as well as orangutans, rhinoceroses, and other creatures. Even the seas are plundered to feed factory farmed animals. A fifth of the world's fish catch never reaches a human mouth directly. Instead, it's ground down and used to feed factory farmed animals on fish meal, leaving the world's seabirds like these African penguins and nearer to home puffins starving. The assault on the countryside with chemicals and industrial agriculture has led to a decline in pollinators, which is really serious, as now is widely recognized, because a third of our food, we rely on pollinators for its very existence. So seeing them take a tumble is bad news indeed. And then the United Nations warns us that if we carry on treating the soil like dirt, in industrial agricultural settings and others, then we could have just 60 years left before the soils are gone or useless. And at that point, it's game over for the food system. So clearly we need a rethink, a top to bottom transformation of the food system. But how did we get here? Let's just go back for a moment to try to understand where it came from. And factory farming has its origins in the US Dust Bowl era, when soil was seen as inexhaustible. It's a tale that's summed up by John Steinbeck's a wonderful, if rather miserable read, The Grapes of Wrath. What happened in that time, of course, was that crop growing turned into factory farming, with agricultural holdings increasingly seen as food factories. Crops and animal products began to achieve record yields, creating a surplus that exceeded demand, causing a price slump. Then came the Wall Street crash in 1929, which dragged the US into the Great Depression. Desperate times led to desperate measures. With prices cut to the bone, cash-strapped farmers ploughed more pasture. And if they couldn't get as much money from their produce, then they would grow more to make up for it. It was a vicious cycle, which led to the US government stepping in 1933 with a package of subsidy measures called the Farm Bill, which lives on today, part of Roosevelt's New Deal. That swept us into World War II, and we've gotten to the point in the US at least where cereals have become so cheap and ubiquitous that you may as well feed them to animals, and government subsidies perpetuated that way of working. Then came the Second World War, and we saw the munitions factories after the war being recommissioned to produce fertilizers, and chemical weapons were repurposed as chemical pesticides. And post-war aid helped to spread the means of intensive farming into Europe. The Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Plan, enabled Europe recovering from the war to buy food at first and then buy the means of food, which saw a free flow of know-how for factory farming into Europe. It then began to become enshrined in 1947. The Agriculture Act of the UK enshrined a new intensive direction. And in 1962, the Common Agricultural Policy of the EU became the big subsidy package that has, for decades now, encouraged intensification. Encouraged through distorted economics, farm subsidies that are used not only in Europe and the US, but worldwide, essentially to encourage farming methods that go against the grain of nature rather than with her. $700 billion of subsidy per year worldwide is spent on distorting the economics around farming. That's $1 million every second. In Europe, for 10 years, for the last decade, 50 billion euros per year have been ploughed into subsidizing agriculture, representing more than a third of the EU's entire subsidy budget. And in the UK, more than £3 billion of agricultural subsidies have generally been ploughed into a system that has encouraged in further intensification. Who benefits? Well, rarely is the farmer benefiting. The benefits are accrued essentially by a range of large companies that are servicing this industrial agricultural model. Fertilizer companies, pesticide companies, pharmaceuticals that are supplying the antibiotics to ward off the diseases of factory farming. It's worth remembering that 73% of the world's antibiotics are fed to farmed animals. No wonder we're heading towards a post-antibiotic era where, due to antibiotic resistance, currently treatable diseases may once again kill. And then there is the grain merchant. Turning grain into meat is a wonderful way to grow your market. You can only sell so many loaves of bread to a family, but if you feed it to animals who then waste several times the amount of grain, the weight of grain, in producing the same weight of meat, you can sell a lot more of your wares. And so the benefit of this industrial agricultural model has been accrued in big companies that make up a global meat industry of worth $1 trillion a year. But don't pity the poor grain merchant. To give you an idea of the economics, I'd like to just share with you very briefly the story of a farmer from Yorkshire. It could be from anywhere in Europe, in geographical Europe, but this guy, Neil Heseltine, is a sheep farmer. He had 400 sheep on the hills. They were too tightly stocked. They were causing overgrazing. He was making from his 400 sheep £500 a year. £500 a year. He was feeding them grain. They're ruminants. Why do you want to feed them grain? Because the grain merchants tell you that that's the thing to do. Anyway, what did he do? Well, he joined an organization called the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. Been going for about 10 years now. It's farmers that are creating a new nature and animal welfare friendly way. And what he did was he halved his numbers of sheep from 400 to 200. He stopped feeding them grain. He sent the grain merchant on his way. Immediately, his sheep were in better health. He wasn't paying for the antibiotics. Immediately, his sheep weren't needing the grain, so he was saving money there. And the hills looked so much better because they weren't being overgrazed. And now, with half the sheep, he makes £17,000 a year. In that story, I hope that gives you some idea of who has been making the money out of industrialized agriculture. All too often, it is not the farmer. So things have to change. I think there's a growing recognition of this. And we're seeing this in the European Union with the Commission's Green Deal. And with the in unveiling the Green Deal, the Commission have talked about climate change and environmental degradation being existential threats to Europe and the world. To overcome these challenges, Europe needs a new growth strategy that will transform the Union into a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. Just look at those words: existential threat, climate change and environmental degradation. These are words which I would use. And what here we have a new commission using these kind of words and setting a course where they believe they want to get to no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, where economic growth is decoupled from resource use, and where no person and no place is left behind. For them to deliver on this, they need to end factory farming. So we've got ourselves into this hole. The European Commission know we're in this hole. How do we get out of this mess? This is a picture from the US Dust Bowl? Well, there are 3 R's to getting out of this mess. The first is regeneration of the countryside. The second is rewilding of the soil and our landscapes. And the third is rethinking protein. So a fast trip through those 3 R's. The first is, what is regenerative farming? Well, it's nature friendly, it's welfare friendly. It moves away from those monocultures of crops and animals, and instead restores animals to the land, restoring that essential contract between us, the animals, and the soil, in a way which means that we can reduce our reliance on pesticides, artificial fertilizers, and antibiotics. It does wonderful things like reducing pollution, conserving water, bringing wildlife back, regenerates the soil fertility that is so important, and in so doing, stores carbon out of the atmosphere. And if we do it right, and we do it enough, we could sequester an awful lot of the greenhouse gases that we need to if we are going to stop runaway climate change. What does it look like? Well, here is a poster child for a new way forward. He's a member of the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association too. This is Tim May. He is not very far away from Oxford. He's actually farming overlooking Watership Down near Basingstoke. And Tim was an industrial farmer. He has a big farm. His farm is 10 times bigger than the national average farm size in the UK, and it used to be wall-to-wall intensive crops with £700 a hectare spent on pesticides. What did he do? He found that his soils were getting tired, his yields were declining, so he stopped buying those chemicals. And he did something radical. He restored animals to their ecological niches, grazing rotational animals to his farm, interspersed with his crops. And now his cattle are followed by sheep in the rotation, who are followed by pigs who are able to feed on the rich pasture and the clover, moving away from that distorted English idiom of like a pig in muck. It should be like a pig in clover, because pigs love clover. And if you do it right, they can have up to 80% of their lifetime diet from the pasture. Pigs, who would have thought it? And those pigs are followed then by hens in a glorious symphony, which brings back biodiversity and brings back soil health. The economic benefits of regenerative agriculture. Here's a source, the Food and Land Use Coalition. What this shows is that if you take the savings and the business opportunities by 2030, then the investment requirements pale into significance of moving to this regenerative agricultural model. The other thing that we need to do, which is linked to regeneration, is rewilding and bring back the elephant. Bring back the elephant to Britain. I'm serious. Bring back the elephant to Europe. Not actually the elephant as in a single living entity, but an elephant's weight of biodiversity that should be harbored in the soil of every fertile football pitch of land. So, and the way to bring back the worms, the springtails, the microbes, the mycorrhizal fungi is that should be living under there at this great weight of biodiversity. The big factor there is not what happens underground, but what you do above ground. Bringing back farmed animals to the mix rotationally helps to bring back this teeming wildlife, rewilding the soil. Now, what's really interesting, building on what we've said about the Green Deal in the EU, is that there is this recognition growing that change is needed. And within the Green Deal is the EU's farm to fork and biodiversity strategies. And again, just look at the language that's being used by the EU Commission, very welcome language. The coronavirus has shown how vulnerable we all are and how important it is to restore the balance between human activity and nature. At the heart of the Green Deal, the biodiversity and farm to fork strategies point to a new and better balance, food systems and biodiversity. points to that thing, the Commission talking about protecting people's health and well-being and how that is connected to what we do to other living creatures, essentially, in the environment. And this strategy sets ambitious targets. By 2030, which is the culmination point of the Sustainable Development Goals, they hope to have cut pesticide use in half, to cut fertilizer use by a fifth, to cut antibiotics in farmed animals by half, and to increase organic farmland up to 25%, as well as reviewing the animal welfare legislation. And they're under pressure to review the animal welfare legislation, not least by more than 1 million EU citizens who signed the European Citizens Initiative, led by Compassion in World Farming, supported by 170 other organizations across the continent, calling for an end to cages. And you know what? If we don't end cages, we can't have nature-friendly farming, which means we can't look after people well. So we're looking forward in just a few days' time to hearing how the Commission will respond to that 1.3 million validated signatures for change. The other aspect is we need to rethink protein. There's been a surge in interest in plant-based diets, vegetarian and vegan, this is great to see. There are now more vegetarians and vegans in Britain and the West than ever before. Certainly that's the impression. And there is also scientifically validated reasoning for why we need to move to more plant-based, less meat-heavy diets. The Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet puts on a plate what's needed for our own health, as well as to stay within those planetary boundaries, which we talked about earlier on. And it means that the EU needs to reduce red meat and poultry consumption by about 66%. And we need to do that pretty quick. And Tim Lang, who will be talking shortly, has been a key contributor to the formulation of the Eat Lancet package. But the overall picture is that, yes, plant-based alternatives are increasing dramatically from a low base. Red meat is marginally down, but chicken and fish consumption is going up. Overall, the trend is going the wrong way for planetary health. Average meat consumption in the EU and the US is set to increase by a tenth. On current business as usual projections, our food alone could trigger catastrophic climate chaos, led by our hunger for meat and dairy. So how do we get away from this? Well, we need to cut by half or more our consumption globally, which is why meat needs a rethink. It needs to be at the heart of climate discussions. It needs to be at the heart of the biodiversity, farm to fork, and other strategies that are looking to build a sustainable future. But rethinking protein is not just about plant-based. There are new alternative proteins coming to the fore. Cultured meat is one of them, produced from stem cells that are mixed in a growing medium in bioreactors. The great thing about these in concept and hopefully in commercial rollout is that the studies show that, that they can be up to 95% lower in greenhouse gas emissions compared with meat from live animals. And they need a tiny fraction of the land use. And they could be hugely prolific. A sample of cells, stem cells from a cow producing 80,000 quarter pounders. The great news is that the first commercial sale of cultured meat happened in Singapore just before Christmas. Widespread availability maybe 5 to 10 years out, but there are real reasons to be positive about the potential for rethinking protein. There's another game in town, fermentation. Corn is a wonderful example of fermentation. Here, think bread and wine. in stainless steel vessels, using bacteria, fungi, or algae, fungi in the case of corn, add the ingredients and see what happens. No animal involved. With precision fermentation, there is a new wave of technology where microbes can be programmed to produce a very particular proteins, any particular protein molecule that you would like, which gives us the opportunity to produce meat like proteins from anything without any animals. And this produces great efficiencies, potentially 100 times more land efficient, 25 times more efficient at turning feed into food, 10 times more water efficient, and can give us the opportunity, if you wanted to take it to an extreme, to even have a food from extinct species, from woolly mammoths, for example. So protein's future, I believe, is the days of factory farming are numbered, not just because we have to move to another way, but because the very thing which for the last half a century has made factory farming viable, favorable economics and anonymity, the fact that it doesn't tell you on meat and milk it comes from a factory farm, those two things will mitigate against the industrial model in the years to come, thanks to these new alternative proteins, plant-based, cultured meat, precision fermentation, and so on. The industrial model has relied, as we say, on those distorted economics. It's a business model that's based on raising huge amounts of animals on very slim margins, which means that if and when a competitor comes along that can undercut those prices, then the industrial model has nowhere to go. It's also vulnerable to disease and climate shocks, and ultimately, I therefore suggest that in the coming years, the economics will cause a tumble in industrial agriculture. Early predictions suggest that by 2035, these modern foods, these alternative proteins, could be 10 times cheaper than the current industrial cheap meat from miserable factory farmed animals. So in conclusion then, Sir David, what people are coming to realize is that, as Lampedusa put it in The Leopard, for everything to stay the same, everything must change. If we are going to ward off that climate, nature collapse and pandemic emergency that's creeping up on us, that's running up at us actually, then we need to change things. We need the EU to take this leadership that is being talked about in the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork and biodiversity strategies and others, and to redirect policies and subsidy measures to move away from factory farming, to reduce animal-sourced foods, to regenerate agriculture, to regenerate farming, bring animals back in connection with the soil, to rethink our protein and to rewild, not least the soil, to bring back that elephant's weight of biodiversity that should be living in every thriving, healthy hectare of European soil. And in so doing, I believe we will open the door to a better future, a future which, rather than looking like the gloomy, desperate, dust-filled arenas of the US Dust Bowl, will look much more like a celebration of life. So David, thank you.
Philip, thank you very much. And thank you for setting the scene so comprehensively, and above all for suggesting solutions which will work and which will improve matters. Thank you very much. Now we turn to Tim Lang.
Hello, thank you, Sir David. I've unmuted myself, I hope.
Yes, you have.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen now. And thank you, Philip, for that great talk. Let me, okay, I hope you can all see my full screen now.
Yes.
Forgive me, if you saw me at the beginning, I was upstairs in my study lined with books showing that I'm a proper academic. And the Wi-Fi has gone pear-shaped. I live in inner London, as it's sometimes done. So I've had to run downstairs and go on my laptop on its own. So I'm going to do some thoughts, as I've put, in response to Philip, whom I know well, and I love that big picture, and it's one I pretty largely share, although I have a long-term discussion about the technology that Philip sees as helping us. I'm not so sure about that, but I get the picture. I want to just very quickly give you, he kindly referred to 4 years of my life, which is really this, which was the Lancet report. Our former title was Food in the Anthropocene, and it came out in the Lancet, well, basically 2 years ago, and it took 4 years to do. It was a huge modeling and very big exercise to say what possible solutions, to pick up Sir David's point, whether to the neo-Malthusian and the rerun of the Malthusian question posed in 1796, can we feed the world healthily and well without destroying the environment? That's the modern version of that debate that Malthus kicked off. And our answer was actually, yes, you can. But it requires a dramatic change, exactly what Philip was arguing. And without going into the boring detail, in one slide, this is it. It requires us to cut off the rapid exploitation of land and biodiversity and wildlife for agriculture, for an inefficient form of agriculture, and instead to rebuild the connection between human bodies and ecosystems through what we eat. And it requires very big changes in some fronts and not much changes in others, and transformations in others. And if you look along the bottom here, we don't really need any more cereals. We've just got to stop feeding them to animals. We need at least 75% more vegetables. We need at least 50% more fruit. We need to cut red meat production by at least 65%, possibly more. The tricky bit is if on proteins, and one of the arguments given in the report was one way of doing that is increasing aquaculture for fish, and we've got to increase legumes, and off on the right of my screen, I hope you can see nuts and seeds. And that really, in nutrition, public health nutrition, is one of the big changes of the last 40 years, actually, in terms of the great interest in the value of nuts and seeds. But broadly, in everyday terms, it's to have a more plant-based diet. Now that's the global picture. We modeled a planetary diet, which clearly you can't eat from resources in Mongolia. You could in southern Italy, you could in Britain, but what we were trying to do was show that there is a positive solution to this dreadful crushing of ecosystems, that the trends in diet towards what we now call the ultra-processed diets high in salt, sugar, and fat, manufactured in factories, and basically denaturing foods. So there's a positive story to say here. What I thought I would do in my talk, my 12 minutes left, was to try and focus in, because this is a UPEP seminar, in on the European politics. And Britain, as a very big member of the European Union, has broken away. Where are we? And in one slide, it's quite dense, this, but I've given Julie my slides, so anyone who wants them can have them. I don't have private slides. I've summarized it, Sir David, I don't know if you agree, or Philip, as sort of a modern tortoise and hare. I've called it tortoise and hare redux, because anyone who knows the European Union and knows how the common agricultural policy has worked, how it's constantly changing, slowly, crab-like, walking backwards, walking sideways. Philip Lymbery's cohorts come in and give commissioners hell. Suddenly we get animals treated as sentient beings. It's taken seriously one moment, then it's not the next. We walk backwards, but it moves slowly forward in a gradually increasing coherence. But we can't say that the UK on its own or the EU together have been food policy successes. We actually share overproduction, malproduction, ultra-processed diets, terrible indicators of diet-related ill health, and low-waged economies. Food is the biggest employer in Europe, but it's characterized by low wages almost everywhere, and Philip's completely right. Farmers get so little from selling food that they have had to be subsidized. Really, the 40% subsidies that Philip rightly pointed to, that CAP represents, the Common Agricultural Policy represents, was propped up in the 1950s, late 50s, because the European, the Common Market, the Six who founded the European Union, what's now the European Union, wanted to regenerate agriculture in the sense of rebuilding it post-war. But it got built into the kind of system of farming and the production of commodities that Philip was pointing to. So I have a slightly different take, but generally the same diagnosis as Philip was giving. The UK now has left 5 years ago and formally is actually out 6 months ago, or nearly 6 months ago now. And I think really the UK is poised to be either a serious food disruptor of trade at the international level, while controlling internally at the subnational level. London dictating to Scotland, Wales, Manchester, London, the subnational level of the UK, what is done. And that politics is beginning to emerge. I think Philip would agree, and I'm sure some people in UPEP will know a lot about that at other levels. And the two big bullet points at the bottom of my page here really summarize what I think is going on. The EU has continued to consolidate and coordinate across food matters. The Green Deal that Philip rightly was introducing, the farm to fork strategy that I've had quite a significant, not my role, but I've been heavily involved in trying to push towards a comprehensive European food policy with more on the focus of consumers, not just on farmers. That has carried on, even in the EU crab-like way, but coherence has continued. Meanwhile, the UK has actually been fragmenting. There's a geographical governance fragmentation. In England, we're waiting for the Henry Dimbleby Part 2 report, the National Food Strategy. We've had the Agriculture Act that was passed in December last year for England, but it's separated agriculture from the environment. It's separated agriculture from food. The Agriculture Act did barely talk about food, barely talked about food. Meanwhile, the EU is now saying agriculture must be about food and health and food and ecosystems, food and water, etc., food and biodiversity, whereas Britain is separating them. I think that is fundamentally important, David, really important that we begin to plot and monitor that. But meanwhile, underlined at the bottom of this slide, the EU is actually feeding Britain. 1/3 of our food still comes from the EU. A lot of people said, hasn't COVID been a great success? We've fed ourselves. No, we haven't. Actually, the food is coming in floods this way, even while disruptions are beginning to emerge the other way at borders. And we're already seeing some really serious politics about Northern Ireland and food getting through to Northern Ireland, as colleagues and I prophesied in a series of papers, or warned about in a series of papers with the Food Research Collaboration. Because basically Northern Ireland exports 240,000 tons of basically dairy and meat, and it imports 240,000 tons of food that the Northern Irish can eat. But now we've got Britain playing this disruptor on a key zone of politics about food quality and standards, the chlorinated chicken and hormones. Again, which I declare an interest, colleagues and I set running in a series of papers in the Lancet. So basically, we don't know where this is going to go, but some parting of the ways is going on just 24 miles from over the cliffs of Dover from Calais. And this is taken from my book, came out the first week of lockdown, Feeding Britain. I essentially arguing and still stand by that it's not certain yet which direction the British government is going in, the UK government. Is it Atlanticist? If we look down the left-hand column, is it Atlanticist? Is it globalist? Is it imperialist, sort of neo-imperialist, going back to the Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, etc., etc. We're seeing tones of that because the Biden election has kind of closed off one of Prime Minister Boris Johnson's favored routes, which is sort of 51st state route. Outer European, so instead of getting intra-EU foods, will we get Libyan, North Tunisian, Israeli, etc., the southern Mediterranean. Euro reform, which way there are some people inside the Conservative government who actually want to maintain those EU food trade links. Is it nationalist UK food self-reliance approach, or a majority position in the public certainly, but getting worried of disinterest? I see these very clear trends and tendencies, which we're not yet certain which way the British, in the end, in say 5 years or 10 years, are going to be, all of which will have a very big impact on the EU. Both the EU and the UK have problems that require collaboration. Let us be very clear. Unless one of the reasons common agricultural policy was a founding, one of the 4 founding policies of what became the EU in the Treaty of Stresa of 1957-58, which created the CAP, was because of the experience of the Second World War, Philip rightly referred to. But one of the reasons the CAP was introduced was to be a solution of nationalist approaches to food and food trade from before the Second World War. But on this slide, I've just, without going into it, you cannot deal with health within one border. You cannot deal with the environment within one border. You cannot deal with trade by just being a buccaneering, let's go forward to 1846, because we haven't got the Navy anymore, and try and say, we will get food from anywhere we like in the world. It ultimately becomes a matter of negotiation, not least over standards. Do you have beef reared with hormones or antibiotics, as Philip was referring to, or do you phase those out? Those are where the really critical issues of food standards and consumer confidence and trust start kicking in. And they're already causing nervousness in the British and indeed European food industries. So food quality is a critical issue, but intersectoral policy processes are essentially essential. The European agri-food problem is absolutely, as Philip was saying, but at the same time, over the last 20 years, since 1992, for 28 years, 29 years, there has been a gradual move into recognition that the environment is quite important from farming. And the McSharry reforms of 1992 introduced what became Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 that the UK has now left. Pillar 1 being about production, Pillar 2 being about ecosystems and social benefits. That is all now gone with the Green Deal and with the Farm to Fork, the F2F approach. This is really important. I put this slide in really just for those who aren't familiar with the slow evolution of the CAP, just to show you, just look at the dates. Every few years, a major shift occurs, which actually is this slow crab-like change process, and it's always trumpeted as resolving everything. Well, there's something in that, but it's a consolidation coordination picture. But the really critical one is this, the beyond 2020, where you see, and I put the graphic from this major statement from the CAP and from the Commission, you can see how even the graphics are saying food is about all of these different issues. The picture says it all, actually, that the EU has recognized we have to have what the Blair government used to call joined up government and joined up governance. And in some detail, I don't expect you to look at it unless you really want to, but I put this in to just show you the sort of detail that's emerging in the farm to fork strategy. And this is where Sir David, in his kind introduction of me, referred to my role through ECOSOC. And I've been one of those people pushing for 25, 30 years, that's how I know Philip, to get more integration. And it's really kicking in actually now in something that even I'm quite impressed by. So I think it's a positive step forward, farm to fork. I won't go into it, but there are things it doesn't say. It doesn't talk about work and jobs. It doesn't talk about the labor process. It doesn't talk about the money flows. And I'll just give you the British figures. In Britain, British consumers spend about £200 billion a year on food. Farming gets about 12 billion of it. If you look at the gross value added from the food system, about 122 billion pounds a year is added down the supply chain as it moves from the farmer to the wholesaler, to the manufacturer, to the retailer, or to the caterer, and then to us down our mouths. Farming only gets about 7% of the gross value added. So that's why the subsidies are there. So when the subsidy is shifted from, as Britain is now doing with the Agriculture Act, it's closing those subsidies of production down. It's going to replace it, not the same amount, but for ecosystems, not for food growing. Whereas people like Philip and I would argue, get the biodiversity, get the environment into the food system, not push it just on the edge. If you have it on the edge, intensification carries on happening in the field and happens in the factory. So that process of change about the labor process, thinking of Adam Smith and Marx and Marshall and all the great political economists, David, that's what I'm referring to, those questions I find in a very big way from the sort of critique that Philip is giving us. We've got to talk more about work, food work. And I'll give you the figures again for Britain. Britain has 4.1 million workers in the food system. Farming is only about 400,000. And if you go full-time equivalents, half that. Food manufacturing is about 450,000. Food retailing is 1.1 million. And hospitality, catering, eating out, cafes, this is just food, is 1.8 million. So we have a fight out going actually between three big sectors: food manufacturing, food retailing, and food hospitality, eating out, cooking out rather than in the home, as to where the money goes. So I am someone, and Philip knows this, who has argued for 4 decades in my work as an academic, that we have to talk more about what people like me call ecological public health. How can we have consumption which is good for human health, good for ecosystems health, and good for all the people who work throughout the system? And the code words that are key, David, Sir David, in this are these 2 words at the top of my title: sustainable diets. The good news about Farm to Fork, the good news about the Green Deal, is that it's talking about sustainable diets. This was absolutely outre when I was the first advisor to the Commissioner on the Environment. This is what we were trying to get. Mrs. Thatcher didn't like it. It was at the time of creating the single market. So I was in the thick of all of that. But sustainable diets is the code phrase for what we're now talking about. What's a good diet for the 21st century? That's what the Eat Lancet Commission report was about, was trying to say, is it possible to model what a good diet would look like? The answer is yes. It's got to be low carbon, low embedded water, low on damage for ecosystems, but giving nutrients, giving value for life, not just life, our lives as humans, but others. And in this slide, I've shown how there are some really serious, and indeed, may I say, vicious politics that goes on at the EU level and the global level when governments get encouraged to try to do guidelines for sustainable diets. It's as though, and Philip, this has to be part, may I say, as a fan of CIWF, this has to be part of your agenda. You've got to start supporting the need to have sustainable diets because we know what they look like now. And we've got to make sure that those shape land use. And in these countries, I put them in, there have been these serious battles. Netherlands is the good story at the moment, actually. Slow, incremental, very European, sidewise moves, then gradually on. But it's getting somewhere really interesting, where it's trying to say land use in the Netherlands has got to be about sustainable diets. Sweden did it, good corporate state that it is, and was made to withdraw it by EFSA, almost certainly under pressure from Poland, almost certainly put up by Smithfield Foods, the giant meat producers, then owned in America, but now owned by China. A very dirty story, I won't go into it. But different countries have tried. In Australia, that we're about to, the UK about to do a trade deal with, I mean, basically a bunch of thugs from the meat industry, killed the public health nutrition advice, including climate change in it. I mean, can you imagine anything so stupid? And we're about to do a trade deal with it. So Brazil, they did it actually brilliantly, but Bolsonaro's pushed it back. USA under Obama, not under President Trump, made suggestions, by law, every 5 years revision of the nutrition guidelines, dietary guidelines for Americans, the process that President Obama set up, which he had to do by law, introduced climate considerations into nutrition advice, and it was overturned by meat lobbying through the Secretary of State for Agriculture, who overturned the colleague he's supposed to have worked with, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Services. So this is a very interesting area, Sir David, for PhD students. You know, it's really
well done.
rich stuff.
Well done.
I'm about to finish. The hot spot for us in Britain is Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy, NFS, and the Part 2 report is due out next month. I'm about to go to a meeting and I talk with him. He's a very decent man, but that's already been involved in very bitter internal fights in Whitehall, the outcome of which is uncertain. But essentially, we don't yet know what direction that's going to paint, and already it's going to be located into a policy framework which is fragmented, back to my opening statement. So what I'm saying is, one of my big thoughts to give, not just to Philip, but to all of us, and those of us interested in the political economy of food at the EU level, is consumers are the elephant in the room. Unless consumers change, the demand factors on supply chains won't alter. And on the right here in this figure is the famous Nuffield Council of Bioethics, chaired by an Oxford academic, John Krebs, then Sir John, now Lord Krebs, at the Nuffield Council of Bioethics. Essentially, it says the effectiveness of interventions and the reframing of food choices occurs the further up the ladder you go, but mostly we're stuck at the bottom, doing nothing, or at the very best, putting it on the label and saying, leave it to consumers to choose. But the problem is, for the reasons Philip was elegantly and eloquently saying, there is a time problem. If we allow 10-year-olds to wait till they're responsible adults and having kids to change diets, reading the labels, well, frankly, the world will be in a worse state. 1.5 will be, most climatologists think, will be more like 2 or 3 degrees change. And just to give you a bit of hard politics, in the new year, this year, Blue Peter, the BBC flagship children's programme, tried to introduce 3 things that children could win a Blue Peter badge for, using less plastics, being nicer to the environment, one of which was to try to consume more plant-based foods, And a ruthless fight went on from the National Farmers Union to get that withdrawn. So, you know, this is what Philip is doing. He looks reasonable, he is reasonable, he sounds reasonable. I know him well, but it's a very messy, tricky, complicated, conflict-ridden things. But in the bottom there is that picture of the Eat Well plate. This is the British national guidelines. That really needs to be thrown away and redesigned as a sustainable dietary plate. And my big last thought, Sir David, is this. Ambition. I'm with Philip, absolutely. This is a time for ambition. And the one bit you didn't say, Philip, is this. I put this in, which is the Hot Springs Conference. I guarantee no one on this call will know what the Hot Springs Conference is. Even in food experts, they don't know what it is. It's where the food system that Philip was being rude about, being politely evidence-based, critical of, but rightly. This is where it was planned, Philip. This is where it was planned. 3 weeks in Hot Springs, chaired by, or brought together by F.D. Roosevelt, while his wife was championing the Human Rights Convention that actually was pioneered originally by H.G. Wells, the British writer. But you can see, if you look at this later, this was serious restructuring. Now, some of us hope that these meetings, in this year, will be that moment. G7 meeting, but the UN Food Systems Summit in September, and the Convention on Biodiversity meeting in China in October, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The UK actually has a prime role to really address this. And what we're hoping is that EU will play the big broker with Joe Biden on that. The danger, Sir David, the danger, Philip, is will Britain be the disruptor? We've got to make sure that isn't the case. So to conclude, agri-food always requires international cooperation. The Brexit promise was repatriation of powers, the sovereignty arguments. I think food standards are already going to be a test case. I think they're likely to be a very serious political test case. The structure of the UK food system is concentrating and fragmenting. Meanwhile, the EU is integrating its policies, witness farm to fork, etc., and ours isn't. All eyes on Dimbleby next month. Over to you, Sir David.
Tim, thank you very much. Very interesting and a very, very good match for Philip's piece. Now, we must get on to Q&A very, very quickly, but I think it's only polite to ask Philip whether he has any immediate thoughts on what Tim said.
Well, my first thought is, having rung my publisher this afternoon to say I've finished the third book, is the Hot Springs Conference sounds like a fertile ground for a fourth one. So maybe I need to ring him back. And
hold the printing presses, Philip, and get it in. I've even given you the cartoon. The cartoon is terrific. It was huge world news, you know. It was huge in 1943, big world coverage.
I look forward to delving deeper, Tim, and I'll be in touch. And I think ambition is really the touchword. We need to be ambitious because time is running out. And Tim, you talked about the need for greater integration for an EU food policy, and I think that's absolutely key to where things need to evolve. I hope that came out in my talk. It's great that the EU is recognizing the joined up nature of food and farming, and that valuing of life, as I put it, that protecting people means protecting the environment and animals too. But I think the important thing, the takeaway for me, which to be honest, I've been doing my damnedest to implement, not just at Compassion, but through the wider movement, is that animal welfare needs to be integrated in this shift towards an environmentally and health friendly food system. And that is why we have moved beyond simply talking about welfare improvements to talking about ending factory farming in favor of this regenerative agriculture, where animals are restored to the land in a way which restores our environment and us too. So you talked about ecological public health, Tim. I totally agree with that. What I talk about is healthy, humane and sustainable food. And I totally agree. We've got key moments coming up with key conferences and conversations. And the UN Food Systems Summit is a key moment where, of course, the UN Secretary General is talking about food system transformation. We need to make sure that that food system transformation is that towards that ecological public health, that healthy, humane and sustainable food system for animals, people and the planet. Thank you so